Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine, and I am joined today by Matt McManus. He is lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan, the author of the books The Emergence of Postmodernity and Liberalism and Liberal Rights. His upcoming book is The Political Right and Equality, but most importantly for our purposes, he is also a contributor to the excellent magazine Current Affairs, where he and I have co-authored several pieces recently. Matt McManus, welcome to Current Affairs.
Yeah, I think it's great to be here. I've been thinking we should have a chat for a long time, so I'm excited for this.
I have too. And first thing I wanted to ask you is, I gather from social media that you are at present, you and I both have a similar task that we engage in a lot of the time, which is the perusing of deeper research into the texts of the right-wing ideological canon. It appears, from what I gather, that you are currently reading the memoirs of one Mr. Ron DeSantis. Is that true?
I am, yeah. I'm writing a review of his book for Jacobin. That should be out hopefully pretty soon, and it's something,
How is it? What's your take?
Well, in the introduction, he rails against elites for about a page and a half at the name of the people, and that's pretty standard stuff. But there's a really striking moment about halfway through the introduction where he's like, by elites, I'm not referring to people of great wealth, accomplishment, or somebody like Clarence Thomas, who went to an Ivy League school, is on the Supreme Court. I'm talking about people who share the same woke ideology. And it's just kind of like, oh, so people who believe differently than you do, they're all elites. Adjunct professors in California and student activists in community colleges in Michigan, I guess they're all part of some mysterious elite. But oil barons in Texas aren't. It's quite a remarkable way of looking at the world.
Well, I don't know what Ron DeSantis' net worth is, but I assume it's not nothing. And Ron DeSantis also is governor of Florida. He is a graduate of Harvard and Yale himself, but presumably does not place himself in the category of elites. There was a new report from ProPublica that recently came out about Clarence Thomas specifically, that is about the luxury trips he went on funded by right-wing billionaires. And yet, in the Ron DeSantis framework, not a, quote, elite, which, as you point out, them is interesting because it means that, you can be a Harvard professor, a Harvard graduate who's the governor, and you could have $1 billion and not be elite. But if you're an adjunct at a community college and you're woke, you are an elite in this framework. But I found that quote that you posted so fascinating. I wanted to bring it up as a kind of intro to thinking about the right view of the world.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a lot you can say rhetorically about it, the way that it mobilizes a kind of populist image to advance what's fundamentally a very anti-democratic and, frankly, I would also argue anti-libertarian kind of politics. On the one hand, it's easy for you and I to laugh at it because it is ridiculous, right? Any world where you sit there and say an adjunct professor at community college is an elite, but a billionaire Texas baron is not an elite, is just one so warped that it's beyond comprehension. But there is something serious about this because it's appealing to millions of people in this country. It's been very effective at mobilizing mass distrust of the left. So it's something that we have to analyze critically.
In the article that you and I co-wrote in defense of college, there's a quote at the beginning from William F. Buckley. And its famous quote, which is, I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people listed in the Boston telephone directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University. It's an interesting quote because William F. Buckley himself is like the ultimate patrician. He is like the definition of an elite. He is a Yale graduate. He is incredibly rich. I think his brother was a senator. He is entrenched in the WASP elite, or he's not. He's Catholic. What's funny is I think there's a quote about how it's strange that America's most famous WASP, who is William F. Buckley, who is in fact Catholic, but he embodies the American elite. But that quote that he's famous for is this kind of populist, boo, Harvard, pointy-headed intellectuals thing.
Oh, absolutely. And it's very indicatory of the kind of rhetorical stances that the political right, in this country especially, is going to take over its 20th century history. So, one of the things that's really interesting about the American right that differentiates it, at least from classical European conservatism, is America was always an imperfect republic, but nonetheless a republic, which meant that there was a certain level of support for mass politics and this idea that we, the people, should rule. Now, of course, how we, the people, is conceived is usually in very chauvinistic, masculist, class-based terms. But it's still important to understand that that had a lot of ideological power. And so you see the political right, especially in the 20th century, trying in a wide variety of ways to present itself as a kind of populist movement, appealing back to this history and claiming to speak on behalf of the people against the elites that are oppressing them. And to be fair to them, it is very much the case that when intellectual conservatism moved like a rose in the 1950s in this country, it was marginal in a certain respect. Buckley pointed out how he basically had to start the National Review with a handful of people and no real knowledge of whether there'd be a receptive audience. And part of the reason for this is that conservative policies had been rightly so discredited by the Great Depression and by the fall of fascism that there was at least a movement to a kind of centrist liberalism as the dominant overtime window in American politics. And Buckley seriously wanted to roll things back. And in the long run, he was quite successful at that, as we saw when Ronald Reagan was elected in the 1980s.
What you said there is quite fascinating, where you mentioned that in the United States, because we have written into our founding documents this sense that the people are sovereign and that their will is ultimately what the government of the country should be founded on, it means that everyone on every side of any political question sort of has to claim a popular mandate. You know, people like Ron DeSantis have to say, oh, the people aren't woke. It's the elite liberals who are imposing this. Whereas on our side, we're always saying, no, the people want this or the people want that. These are popular movements. But there is a conservative intellectual tradition or a set of texts and thinkers, right, that is pretty openly not populist, that is contemptuous, sort of openly contemptuous of democracy, and that basically says, no, the people don't know anything. They shouldn't be in charge. Their betters should be in charge.
Oh, absolutely. And this is true of both more moderate conservatives, and certainly in the European tradition, and more radical ones. So let's take the two founding intellectuals of contemporary conservatism, Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre, as examples, right? Edmund Burke is usually held up as the more moderate, Whiggish, even kind of liberal figure between the two. And yet, if you read his books, he denounced the masses as the swinish multitude, had nothing but contempt in many instances for ordinary people, certainly when they demanded some share of political power. And in a famous passage of Reflections on the Revolution of France, where he talks about the kind of rights that people are entitled to, he explicitly singles out rights to political participation and says, I deny that they should be granted equally to everyone. And that's really quite telling about the kind of political system that he wants to see implemented. Although it's really interesting about his work is when he recognizes that just denying people rights to political participation and saying, obey your betters or else, might not do the trick in the long run, particularly in a revolutionary epoch. And this is where he criticizes the Enlightenment philosophers for stripping away what he calls all the pleasing illusions that made subordination or submission easy and gentle. And he talks overtly about the need to resublimate various forms of authority with a kind of grandeur that'll make people think that it's their duty, either the divine duty or their natural duty, to obey these kinds of figures. So you start to see Burke workshop a lot of the kind of rhetorical and philosophical techniques that later conservatives are going to try to use in order to give a kind of gloss to really just a bunch of bad ideas and half-baked arguments. Joseph de Maistre is even more fascinating this way, when at various points in his work, he talks about how there is nothing more important for the maintenance of good government in society than for every individual to come into the world with a set of beliefs, dogmas, and prejudices ready-made for them. And the reason for this is, he says, the last thing we want is for everyone to be deliberating on politics, thinking for themselves, exercising their own reason. If they start to do that, then everyone is going to think they're entitled to question authority and to have a say in how authority should be organized. And that's the last thing that we want.
Yeah, you have at the beginning of your article that you did for us, why conservative intellectuals are anti-intellectual. You have a quote from Joseph de Maistre, and I'll just read it here. Every conceivable institution either rests on a religious idea or is ephemeral. Institutions are strong and durable to the degree that they partake of the divinity. Not only is human reason, or what is ignorantly called philosophy, unable to replace those foundations, ignorantly called superstitions, but philosophy is, on the contrary, an essentially destructive force. Seems to be arguing that reason is bad. You shouldn't start questioning the church. You shouldn't start doing philosophy and asking what the foundations of authority are, because the moment you start interrogating the sort of myths that sustain society, you might find that they're founded on very little, and then they'll crumble and society will crumble with it.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes they're very honest about that, right? I mean, Burke pointed out again when he lamented that all the pleasing illusions that made submission easy were being torn down, that once the empire of reason, as he calls it, holds sway over everyone, a king is just going to appear as a man, a woman is just going to appear as a queen, and all the kind of beauty and drama of the world will be stripped from it. And of course, as good socialist rationalists, we want to sit there and be like, but a king is just a man and a queen is just
Right.
a woman.
But it's true.
Yeah, that's what they are. I mean, you can put as many silly hats on them as you want and put their asses on as many refined chairs as you want. That's what they are. In fact, if you look at the House of Windsor, they're not even that impressive people intellectually, culturally, or morally, right? But this is important when we try to understand how it is that a kind of conservative anti-intellectualism is built in to this wariness of democracy. Because central to this democratic outlook is the idea that people should think for themselves. They should decide what kind of government that they want. They should decide what kinds of power that they are willing to erect as authorities over them. And this requires constant deliberation and participation on the part of the people. And one of the goals of conservatism has been to deny or at least chasten that to the extent possible. De Maistre is just a more extreme figure than Burke in this respect, where he thinks that all reason is fundamentally a destructive force because it corrodes the ready-made dogmas and prejudices that one comes into the world and has ready-made for you and aligns you with respect for the kind of authorities that propagate these dogmas and prejudices in the first place. If you think that these are antiquarian views, though, Roger Scruton, probably the greatest conservative philosopher of the 20th century and the early 21st, even said in The Meaning of Conservatism that at the essence of his thinking is a deep respect for what he called unthinking people. And the reason he said he liked unthinking people is because these are individuals who will bear the burdens of life gracefully and stoically and not seek to lodge blame in the political institutions that organize their social world, but instead try to resolve all their own problems individualistically, right? Praise of unthinking people is at the root of conservatism for exactly this reason.
You mentioned that if we start scrutinizing monarchs, they appear to us to be mere people, and we start wondering why they deserve to have so much power and wealth. I wrote an article years ago about the British royal family, the House of Windsor, and began with what I think is a fascinating incident in the life of the royal family, where in the 1960s, the monarchy, they were worried that the monarchy was losing popularity, right? It's the 60s, everything's gone crazy, people are questioning authority. And so the royal family decides that in order to help maintain the Queen's reputation, they're going to film a documentary about her. And so they let the BBC television crews follow the Queen through her days and hanging out with her family. They go to a barbecue and Prince Philip is cooking. She's opening her mail and she's playing with her kids and she's being a mom. And they aired the documentary about the Queen, and hugely popular. And everyone, the Queen comes off in it very, very well. I watched it. She seems lovely. You like the Queen in it. You think, oh, she's a great mom. She seems a very down-to-earth person. She handles being Queen well. You come away really liking the Queen. And then the Queen banned the film from ever being shown again. And what they realized was that the film was actually a terrible idea because it had made the Queen likable, but it had also destroyed the mystique of monarchy. because she just seemed like a mom. And it's like, well, she's not the queen. You might like her. She might be a nice lady, but you come away from it going, but why should that person be the queen? And so they thought this documentary is actually the most dangerous thing to happen to the monarchy in hundreds of years. And so they wouldn't allow it to be shown again.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, Burke and Scruton and de Maistre would have all warned the monarchs that this is a real danger if you try to lean too heavily into humanizing yourself. Because while you might elicit sympathy if you come across as just another human being, because any normal person will feel sympathy for another person. I hope so, at least, right? Compassion is usually a pretty admirable virtue. But you don't obey somebody you sympathize with, and certainly don't obey somebody you empathize with, because these are both emotions that emerge under conditions of equality where you can see yourself as being kind of like them, right? That's not what Burke, de Maistre, or any defender of monarchy wants. What they want is for you to regard these institutions and people as sublime in some way, bigger, larger than life. And I don't want to imply that this is all conspiratorial either. A lot of conservatives have really thought that life is enriched in some way through submission to authority that we regard as sublime, because then we get to feel like we are being brought into something that is larger than ourselves without having any kind of say in how it's organized. De Maistre again was really overt about this, where he kind of co-opted some democratic language and said that there is no institution that is more elevating for the common man than the monarchy and submitting to the monarchy, because then you get to participate and enjoy in some of its splendor. Now, I think that this is a bogus idea, because I've never really seen anything all that splendid about paying taxes to the monarch so that, she can cover up any other kind of scandal that happens to rise in her family. But it's important to note that they are right that you can form a politics about this. Many people call de Maistre the godfather of fascism, and many fascist demagogues in the 20th century will look at this idea of allowing the people to participate in authoritarian rule and having that as a kind of elevating enterprise and say, that's what we want to go for.
Empathy and equality. But as I was thinking about that Queen documentary, your first reaction is, wow, I love the Queen. She's just like me. And then you go, hang on a minute, she's just like me. And that turns you into a Republican, that small r Republican, overnight by realizing that they're in fact just like you. So that all of this, I suppose that helps to explain all of the pageantry that we associate with the fascism, every effort has to be taken to artificially elevate the ruler as something, surrounding them with giant flags, putting them on a big podium, so anything to convince you that this is not just a person who, shits and pisses like you do.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And I mean, you can see this in the kind of imagery that conservatives tend to be attracted to. If I go online 1,000 times a day, I'll encounter far-right figures, and it's always Caesar, Kaiserite imagery, monarchical imagery, these kind of larger-than-life figures. And to a certain extent, this is just an aesthetic where they're attracted to the kind of excitement and glamour to it. But there's also a political point, right? Which is that these larger-than-life figures are supposed to be bigger than the average human being, which is precisely why you should obey them. And that's why I think somebody like Mary Wollstonecraft did was very effective when she criticized Burke, where she pointed out that he spends an awful lot of time glamorizing the French monarchy and especially nostalgia for it. And she just says, you have a mortal antipathy to reason. And if there's anything like argument in anything that you're talking about, it's just this kind of weird injunction that we should revere our betters. And if they are in fact our betters, then sympathy should lead us to forgive them of their sins. And she says these are Gothic notions of political argumentation. But, the reality is that as beautiful as the ivy may be, if it chokes out new growth, who wouldn't tear it up? And she was absolutely right. And what she does really effectively, and what we should do, is point out that a lot of times when conservatives try to glamorize or jazz up power by making it into something sublime, what they're doing is polishing a turd, right? A lot of the time, these people are ridiculous and they don't deserve any kind of respect whatsoever, let alone the kind of sublime connotations that conservatives so desperately want to ascribe to them.
Mm-hmm. Going back to, because I'm struck by what you said about the United States, because I do feel like you found something that really is a point in our favor, in that we have at least come to a fairly strong national consensus that democracy is a good thing, that reasoning about public reason, the public engaging in reasoned deliberation about the policies they want, That's good. So everyone has to use this language to justify the things they want to do. It's quite rare to have books like I reviewed Jason Brennan's Against Democracy, which argues that we should all be ruled by epistocrats. He calls them epistocrats, just the people who know, the knowledge people. Now, he doesn't believe in hereditary monarchy, but he somehow believes that, we'll take a test, and if you score high on the SAT, then you become an epistocrat and you get to rule over everybody else. I think this is a pretty minority position. I don't think you would find anyone in American public political life who would endorse that position openly.
Oh, absolutely. It's very rare. I mean, you do still see references to it, sometimes in coded language, sometimes a little bit more overtly, but it's usually walked back pretty quickly. A very good example of this is Thomas Sowell, right? So in 2016, Sowell, when it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to be winning or win the election, strongly suggested that large numbers of American voters should not actually vote. Implied maybe that even they should be denied the right to vote because they could not be trusted to make good decisions, right? Went on Fox News and he went on this long, very elitist kind of tirade about it. But then, of course, the minute Donald Trump won the election, he was railing against elites who weren't willing to accept the will of the people, who were, kind of populist in their disdain for ordinary Trump voters. And this is very typical, right? Vacillating back between this extremely chauvinistic and elitist language and trying to appeal a pseudo-populist street cred when you think that it might be in your favor. And you see something similar right now with a lot of the Peter Thielites or G.D. Vancites, right? Where on one day they'll be talking about the need to strike out against the elites and eliminate wokeness. But then when you start talking about things like, well, maybe we should be encouraging more people to vote, or maybe we should eliminate restrictive voter ID laws, all of a sudden they'll start talking about how America is not a democracy, it's a republic, right? And we can't have all these people participating because it will undermine our sacred plutocratic institutions. So I think that this kind of vacillation is more common on the political right than it would be on the political left, which has generally been consistently dedicated to the most robust conception of democracy you can imagine. But like you said, overt denunciations of democracy for elite rule are very, very rare.
Yeah, J.D. Vance constantly tweeting about the elites, right? Even though he was made by Yale Law School, the only reason he has a career is because a Yale law professor took interest in him as as the Trump explainer.
Having a billionaire backer doesn't hurt either, right?
You're right. Billionaire, Yale Law School, these institutions. But then he's inspired by, there's this Vanity Fair piece about, he and a few others, Blake Masters and some other people who are inspired by neo-reactionaries like Curtis Yarvin, who believes openly in monarchy, right? He believes that basically democracy should be abolished and that a CEO should be put in charge of the United States so that the authoritarian structure of the American corporation extends to the state itself.
Well, this is kind of why I like Moldy a little bit, because in some ways he's like...
That's Yarvin, mentions, but for people who don't know.
Because in some ways he's like the raging id of American right libertarianism. And he will be overt about the kind of things that they want to be a little bit more subversive about. And in some respects, he's also just bringing about the consistent endpoint to their philosophy, which is why I appreciate his work. So if you read a lot of his stuff from the late 2000s and early 2010s, he starts off as a pretty conventional right libertarian, evoking Charles Murray, talking about why it is that, we shouldn't be putting restrictions on creative types freedom. Very, very, very enamored with the figure of Steve Jobs, who, just every libertarian's go boy at that point. But later on in his work, he starts to think that, well, the biggest problem for libertarians is the fact that most people don't actually want to live in a libertarian society. And it doesn't seem like we can actually convince them to graduate to a libertarian society, no matter how hard we try. So just like Peter Thiel and his essay, The Education of a Libertarian, he decides that so much the worse for democracy then. What we need to do is set up an authoritarian state with a CEO in chief. This will help to establish the most meaningful kind of liberty, which will be the liberty for the elites. And everyone else will just have to deal with it. Like I said, there is something that's refreshing about someone who's that candid about what will be entailed to ensure the full realization of their philosophy. Because I do think that he is correct that most Americans don't actually want to live in a libertarian dystopia of the type that people like Thiel want. And it would take tremendous amounts of force and tremendous authoritarianism in order to create a such a society and stabilize it. It's not like he's backed down from that argument. In a recent piece he wrote about getting Tolkien-pilled is the new terminology he's using.
What is it?
Tolkien-pilled. The J.R.R. Tolkien.
Like the Lord of the Rings?
Yeah. No, he's gone on a Lord of the Rings streak, I guess. But anyway, it's quite striking how willing he is to double down on these arguments. So he divides society into hobbits, dark elves, and high elves. And he says that...
Well, now we're talking serious political philosophy. We're getting pretty academic here.
Yeah, we're getting really deep into the weeds now. This is like some Heidegger level stuff. So get out your pen and paper because we're going to have to go through this slowly. But long story short, the hobbits are those who belong to the cathedral, right? They're woke, they're progressive. And for
They belong to the what?
The cathedral, right? And the high elves more or less...
You're going to have to say what the hell that means in the parlance of these people.
Oh, so the cathedral refers to essentially this shadowy cultural hegemony that progressives have wielded over the United States and indeed most of the Western world, at least since the 18th century, probably going back to the 17th century. And it's a very totalizing conception of power and includes progressive control of the media, higher institutions, politics, the economy, you name it, right? Noam Chomsky is one of the most elite figures in American politics. He might be a bit surprised by that, given that the police dragged him to jail a couple of times, but that's the way it is, right? And so the new terminology is that the high elves are members of the cathedral. They can still control most of the country despite efforts by people like Jacobin to undermine them. So what needs to happen are conservative hobbits, by which he means ordinary people, will answer the call of the dark elves, who are also part of the elite, but are not supportive of the cathedral's value system. And once the hobbits align themselves with the dark elves will sweep to power. They will establish, again, this kind of CEO-ocracy. But then it's very telling that Jacobin says the hobbits then need to go back into their holes. And even the conservative hobbits now don't get a say in politics. Dark elves will run everything for them. And again, there's a certain kind of admirable straightforwardness about this, where you essentially see somebody telling the conservative base, your job is to put us in power in your behalf.
So that we can abolish democracy and make sure we never have to listen to you again.
Exactly. And then go back into your holes and trust that we will do what it is that you want, because we're certainly not going to give you any kind of say. What do you think this whole enterprise is about? Right?
Well, not even trust that we're going to do what you want, but trust that we're going to do what we deem to be in your best interest, regardless of whether you want it.
Exactly, right? This is actually quite a serious topic because Jacobin was once a pretty idiosyncratic figure, but Peter Thiel backs him. Steve Bannon has had nice things to say about him. Chris Rufo has started taking him seriously as an intellectual presence. And for those of you who don't know who Chris Rufo is, he's basically Ron DeSantis' fixer-in-chief. For some baffling reason, been in charge of Florida's post-secondary education system. That references Jacobin very positively all the time. So sadly, despite the fact that you and I might have a hard time taking high elf and Tolkien-pilled rhetoric seriously, it's something that we just have to mesh through as people who comment on the political right from a progressive standpoint.
You know, I didn't know about this whole Tolkien theory of politics. I just hate it so much, because it's so far away from anything that I think any of the frameworks that I think we ought to understand politics by. And I think I've written before, though, that conservative thinkers, such as they are, seem to inhabit a fantasy world. And this is quite literally a fantasy world in which they tell a story about, themselves being oppressed and weak and powerless, and them being dominated and lorded over by groups that, to me, with my, I know that you're not supposed to use reason and philosophy because they might destroy these wonderful, pleasing myths and fantasies that sustain civilization. But to me, the groups that they claim to be oppressed and persecuted by are actually quite marginal and on the fringes. I think they live in Topsy Turvy land, where Noam Chomsky is powerful rather than a dissident who is opposed by the entire foreign policy establishment and ignored, where, trans people and immigrants and low-wage workers are all vastly more powerful then, and unions, and teachers who are all underpaid and overworked, right, are this incredibly powerful force in society. That really does seem some confirmation that they live in a story they tell.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, this even applies to people like you and me, right? I constantly get told by conservative media that I'm brainwashing generations of decadent cultural Marxists. And experience tells me that if I can get them to read 50% of the stuff that I assign them with the promise that then they will graduate and get a job afterwards, I'm doing a fucking great job, right? That's being brought for you right now. But I mean, it really is quite remarkable. And just to go back to Jacobin for a second, sometimes this really does get kind of ironic, but kind of not, where they will intentionally make it hard to tell whether you are supposed to take them seriously in order to gain a kind of plausible deniability, depending upon who's actually reading this piece. But this can be really quite sinister at points. So, for instance, in Jacobin's telling, you want to talk Topsy Turvy land, the biggest problem with US foreign policy over the 20th century was how soft we were on the Soviet Union, just deeply friendly towards them in almost every way that matters. And it's also important to note that Nazi Germany was not an aggressor state, but considered itself as fighting a defensive war against major threats like Poland and the Netherlands and Belgium. And it's important to recognize that the Axis powers were actually something like the Rebel Alliance, is the terminology he uses in the Second World War, because they were fighting against the hegemonic forces of the cathedral, embodied in the world's premier communist state and the world's premier democratic state. And Jacobin says, this doesn't mean, of course, that I'm a fascist or apologizing for fascism, but it's just noteworthy how powerless these right-wing forces were to confront the cathedral. It's just something that he's observing, right? Really chilling stuff if you kind of think through the implications of this rhetorical resituation, right? But again, when you press him on things like this, he'll usually say things like, well, I'm just joking, or I'm just raising questions, or they're not actually getting the real argument. This is why it's so frustrating dealing with these people sometimes, because they're very slippery in this way, even when they're peddling the most monstrous kind of views.
You and I both take right-wing political philosophy more seriously, perhaps, than a lot of our colleagues on the left, or at least we engage with it more. We read it, we try and understand what the arguments are. Some people who agree with us ultimately might say, what is the point? You're just dealing with a bunch of fascists trying to construct bad faith ways to rationalize their own power and their own maintenance of power in society. And I think what's kind of interesting is almost that, after going through the arguments carefully, it's not that we come to a less harsh conclusion. It's like, taking someone seriously as a political philosopher doesn't mean, you had this great article about Alexander Dugin, where you say the fact that someone's a political philosopher doesn't mean they're not also a maniac. But that raises the question, if you and I go, okay, look, we're going to take the philosophy seriously, we're going to read it, we're going to examine all the arguments, and then we come out and we come essentially to the same conclusion, which is, yeah, these are a bunch of terrifying anti-democratic fascists who want to destroy everything we care about. What is the point of having engaged deeply in the work of analyzing and understanding the philosophy?
Well, I think there are a few different things. One is that understanding the history of the right, particularly as understood by its premier intellectuals, can really help you anticipate what it is that they're going to do next and help you understand why it is that they're doing what they're doing. And this is something we bring up in our article about college, right? Many people are surprised to see the same kinds of people who talk about ideological diversity and free speech all of a sudden cracking down on critical race theories and all kinds of books about LGBTQ rights. And my argument would be what William Buckley said in the 1950s. He was very clear about what he meant by free education or quality education. It meant that university professors were supposed to teach the truth, which of course meant whatever Buckley thought was true. And it in no way entailed support for something like academic freedom. And you can even go back further to people, again, like Burke or de Maistre, where they make it very clear that they think the kind of education people should get is one that teaches them to be dogmatic, accepting of prejudice, and to use Thurton's term again, largely unthinking and uncritical of their society. And when you know that history, you look at what DeSantis is doing, or you look at all these kinds of bills trying to ban books from libraries, and you say, of course, right? Par for the course. The other reason I think it's important to do this, and you pointed this out a lot in your work, is that there's just something really frustrating about all these fucking right wingers constantly saying, oh, they won't debate us, they won't argue with us, they won't take our work seriously, and using that to kind of give a almost countercultural glamour to their defenses of power and privilege. That was part of what motivated me. It just really pissed me off, where I'm like, so you guys are defending your billionaires, your oil barons, your Peter Thiels of the world. You're the kind of countercultural figures. And there's a part of you who just wants to say, we'll see about that. We'll actually take your arguments seriously as arguments, and we'll point out what's wrong with them. And what I think comes clear once you do start taking a lot of these people seriously is that they don't have particularly good arguments for their positions. That's not to say that they can't write a good book that is rhetorically powerful. And I think in a lot of cases, the right are better writers, frankly, than the left. You make that point as well, which is a really unfortunate thing that we need to do something about, right? But once you actually unpack what it is that they're saying, it becomes a lot less convincing. Well, what's just really telling, right? Once you actually start to think about it, it becomes less convincing, not more. When confronted with a good argument, the opposite is usually true, right? Even if you don't want to agree with it, the more you think about it, the more convincing it becomes, right? But anyway, long story short, and I think the last reason that it's important to understand this is the right isn't going to go anywhere anytime soon. I think that there was this kind of naive teleological vision on the part of many in the left, dates back to the 18th century, that saw conservatism or counter-revolutionary movements as on the wrong side of history, and they would eventually be swept away by the tide of progress. This is something Hirschman talks about very eloquently in his book, The Rhetoric of Reaction. That hasn't happened, right? Conservatism has proven enduring, highly capable of competing in the marketplace of ideas, and even quite capable of mobilizing mass support where it needs to. And so I think we need to give up this teleological conceit that history is just going to vindicate us, recognize that conservatism and the right are going to be around for a while, and we are constantly going to need to do battle with them in every terrain conceivable. And that's going to include in the intellectual terrain, which is why we need to take their arguments seriously, but critically.
Yeah, what you said with once you unpack the arguments that become less convincing, I think is so true, because when I wrote my long thing about Jordan Peterson, I actually read his book Maps of Meaning, and I came to understand that a lot of why he's convincing to people is that he makes arguments that might sound plausible, but he does kind of the Zizek tactic of saying a lot of things that are very confusing, but that sound intelligent, and then you're like, I think that's true, maybe that's true. And so I went through and started taking it apart. When you take it apart, it falls apart. And I know that it's worked because I've gotten lots of feedback from people who used to like him who've gone, well, I read your thing and then I saw that the arguments didn't work. You can, in fact, convince people by taking the arguments to pieces.
Oh, absolutely, right? I mean, Peterson is a very talented rhetorician, right? And oftentimes, if you're not attentive to what it is that he's saying, and people like him, right, are very talented rhetoricians, there's kind of surface appeal to it, right? The second part of his conservative manifesto, which was released on YouTube, he talks about how there seems to be something deeply and mysteriously irremovable about inequality in nature. And he points out how most of the stars have most of the mass, how rivers all tend to move towards the same place. Most authors tend to publish very few books, and there's only a few authors that publish books that everyone knows. And he runs through this long list of kind of metaphors. And if you listen to this, again, it has an almost sublime quality to it where you're like, wow, very few stars in the sky have most of the mass. I guess inequality is just baked into nature. But then you just think about it for a second, and you're like, well, hold on, right? We could also just do the same thing in the opposite direction, right? In the end, all people are equal because we are all equally destined for the grave, right? The rain falls upon the just and the unjust alike, right? Everyone is equal when they're on the toilet. You can just appeal to this kind of rhetoric however it is that you want, because ultimately it's not saying anything, right? What's at issue here isn't the notion that certain kinds of stars are bigger than others, or that people are fundamentally different in their physiological characteristics in important ways. It's whether or not we should allow certain kinds of inequalities to persist in society where there doesn't really seem to be much need for them. And in fact, they seem to be harming people in very, very transparent ways. And once you start to think about it that way, a lot of the kind of rhetorical bombast that he uses to try to justify inequality just comes across as really airy and frankly pretty pretentious.
Another reason I found for engaging these arguments is it actually helps you understand why you think what you think. And I think that, you and I wrote this article called In Defense of College because Charlie Kirk Attack on College that you actually reviewed separately, but there's all this anti-college rhetoric on the right. And I don't think it was until writing that article that I came to understand some things about the right's attack on college, because you brought in, as we wrote that piece together, all this stuff about how there's a tradition of actually opposing reason and opposing thinking. Because when you start thinking, when you start questioning things like, I don't know, the gender binary, when you start just applying reason to things that they want you to accept, it is a destructive force. Why? They're not wrong, in fact, that college is a place that is going to educate people who come out attacking institutions and hierarchies and norms that conservatives would like to preserve. But it's not because of woke indoctrination. It's because college is teaching you that you're allowed to think about things yourself. You're allowed to question things, that you don't have to accept something just because someone told it to you while you were growing up. And so I don't think until I actually wrote the article, I quite understood the power of college. And in constructing this defense of college, I really now do believe it. I came out really thinking, college is a very, very valuable institution in our society, and we need to defend it. And I like it. And even though I have all my own criticisms of academia, I'm going to defend it against this onslaught of right-wing attack.
Oh, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think this is a very important thing to emphasize, right? Which is that not just college, but any kind of critical thinking or rational inquiry makes you aware that there are alternative possibilities for our society. Now, that doesn't mean that all alternative possibilities are equally good, or even that we should change society. Maybe it's the case that society is actually doing quite well as things stand. I don't think so, but you have to make an argument for change, right? But by even raising the specter that we could change things, what you alert people to is the fact that existing power structures aren't natural in some way, shape, or form, and they're definitely not inevitable, that they're open to contestation and analysis. And this is the kind of thing that conservatives have been at war with for a very long time. Not just the specific proposals that the left is putting forward, although that's bad enough, but the fact that many leftists think that it's even open to them to put forward alternatives in the first place, which by necessity denaturalizes and demystifies power as it exists right now, and so makes it open to political agitation.
Because one thing I wanted to ask you is, you're a political philosopher, why you think political philosophy is valuable, but what you've hinted at there's something inherently radical. It's not obviously there are plenty of political philosophers who aren't particularly radical, but there is something a little bit radical about the fact that political philosophy, by being political philosophy, assumes that power requires a justification. You can't just impose it. And the moment that you assume this foundational premise of all political philosophy, that you are entitled to interrogate the reasons why power is structured the way it is, and you have to find a justification, you have a tool that is like a monarchy-destroying intellectual tool, which explains why I think it's one reason why monarchies just sort of crumbled in so many places, because the moment you think to ask, well, why does this person get to be the king? You find out that there's no answer, that it was all depending on you not asking the question.
Oh, absolutely, right? This is an argument that you can trace all the way back to Socrates, right? And it's one of the reasons I find it so obnoxious when conservatives claim to be defending the Western canon, so-called, against all these critical woke activists. Even Leo Strauss was aware of the fact that if you interrogate somebody like Socrates carefully, there's a very anti-conservative quality to what he's doing. Because what is he doing? He's going out there undermining faith in the gods of the city, undermining faith in the authority of the city, and pointing out that there are different ways of maybe doing things than how Athens has been doing them for the last 30 years, which is what brought us to this calamitous situation in the first place. And the powers that be did not like him for that. Now, Strauss, as a good conservative philosopher, was going to say, this is exactly why the only people who can engage in political philosophy are a certain kind of rarefied elite. And it might even be necessary for this elite to propagate various kinds of noble lies to the general population so that they're not aware of what a fickle foundation existent power structures rest upon. And then the elite can inquire amongst themselves about whether they should afford things or not. But what you've seen really quite transformative over the last 300 or 400 years is a spread of a certain kind of philosophical or Socratic disposition to the general population. Now, this has its bad side, right? Sometimes, people who criticize things like COVID vaccinations, or who say, every view is just as good as any other view. That's a kind of dangerous disposition to take. But I think that the broad spread of critical thinking skills across the population has been healthy for society. There's a fundamentally democratic and equalizing propensity to it. And again, it's something that conservatives have always tried to put back into the bottle, but the genie keeps on getting back out, and we should hope that it continues to do so.
Yeah, I always think that the Athenians, they weren't totally irrational to understand that Socrates needed to be killed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, who did he direct his attention to? The wealthiest, most dogmatic, most fundamentalist Athenians in the city, the kind of people who would walk around with a lot of money in their pocket, feeling very satisfied about their viewpoints. And when they were actually interrogated about why they should hold the views that they do, or why they should enjoy those positions of authority, they couldn't give a good answer to it. What encouraging people to adopt this critical disposition does is, like I said, open them up to the prospect that there are other possibilities for how we could do things, possibilities that might very well be better than what we have right now. And as long as people believe in that, it is very hard to convince them to be conservative in the sense of accepting the world the way that it is and submitting to existent authority structures. I am very hopeful that we will never go back to such a world. I like a situation where people are free to think for themselves and share their opinions with us, even if I happen to think that their opinions are really bad, which I often do, because there's something that's democratic and spirited about this. And that kind of democratic spirit is hostile to any attempts to establish various forms of authoritarian structure. And that's why it's something we should treat with a lot of reverence.
Well, that stirring defense of the task of political philosophy, we shall conclude. I hope that I'm very proud of the things that you and I have written together in Current Affairs, the Defensive College, and the article about Douglas Murray. I hope that you and I will get to write together again. I like your writing a lot. I think it's very, very valuable. So people should follow Matt McManus. They should read everything Matt McManus publishes, and they should look out for his upcoming book. Matt McManus, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. I had a great time. Hopefully we can do this again sometime.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.